So we're going to talk about parts of the camera and its use and its care and stuff like that in and around the things we've already addressed. And so this is the camera obscura that I talked to you about verbally. I don't remember showing you an actual slide. So this is, what's kind of cool is look at the translation. Camera in Italian means room, and obscura means dark. You know that from chiaroscuro, right? So, so the name of the first camera was Darkroom. I kind of love that. So you can see what's happening is very similar to the principle I illustrated with your pinhole camera, is that the light's coming in, but now he's got a lens to allow a little more light in. And that lens is bouncing off of a mirror that's angled, labeled M in the diagram. And then what's happening is it's kind of being reflected up like a rear projection screen onto this clear sheet of glass. It's got a little folded up thing that's labeled triangle. I think originally that may have been an A. I don't know what that was. Yeah, you would think. But in this pixelated version, we could call that delta, I guess. I don't know. But so this is just to kind of block the sun, like when you're going to pick out Redbox videos. And then here, he's got his paper sitting on the glass, and this image is cleverly being bounced up, and he's seeing it through the back of his paper enough so he can trace the little happy garden scene or whatever it is he's drawing. And so this was a really popular drawing aid through the Renaissance, really. And so what I think the really interesting thing to me is that the invention of photography, the holdup, and I think I mentioned that to you before, the holdup in photography wasn't so much the camera, it was the chemistry, because they've been using the camera obscura for so long. So we talked about this before, the essential parts of the camera. Now you had a can, it was a light tight box. You stuck a hole in it for a lens to restrict the light coming in. And then you put a piece of tape on that as a shutter to control when the light came in and out. And so then this is basically how your image is formed. If it's just the pinhole, that light coming through at an angle is restricted and it has to go at that angle. And we saw how it would spread out more or less depending on how deep that box might have been that you used. And so then, of course, film and a viewfinder are nice extras. As you learned from working with the pinhole camera, you didn't necessarily know exactly what you were going to get. And so that's partly why I brought the cameras in that I did, is that there have been so many iterations of viewfinders. This little one is similar to what's on the camera that you guys have down the hall as well. And it's just this kind of little glass prism. And so it takes a little while to see that you're even seeing something in it. But so this, if I look down into it, gives me a view of where I'm aiming my camera. And then cleverly, if I wanted to turn the camera and take a landscape format, what? It's so clever. So now I can, kind of get an idea. And obviously, viewfinders have really changed a lot over the years. This one, you also have a version down the hall there, is you're looking down into it. This is called a twin lens reflex camera, and it's because there are two lenses. You only would take pictures with the bottom lens, and the top lens has very much like the camera obscura as far as the arrangement. There's going to be there's an angled mirror in the back inside of this camera. So light comes in this lens, bounces up that mirror, and is projected on the screen. So this is really a lot like a little walkie camera obscura. And the only difference is this has a little hidden compartment for film in the bottom. And so whenever we open this up, this is where the film hangs out. And you can...
Was it always roll? They always
film, no. There was also sheets, cut film as we call it, that got used. For this particular type, this would have always been rolls, but when you get into these older ones, this guy in particular was roll. You can see where the little rolls would have gone. And then there's a larger format, 4x5, which is like the speed graphic and Graflex cameras. Those actually, individual sheets of film. So moving through the history of viewfinders, what makes your camera and any camera called SLR, single lens reflex, twin lens reflex, you've got one lens for viewing and one lens for taking a picture. So you can imagine you could have something in front of one lens, but not so much the other, and there'd be some discrepancy in what you're seeing. The excitement about this, as far as being a photographer is concerned, is that what you see is what you get. That mirror is going to bounce the light through this lens onto a mirror, up to your eye. It turns upside down and comes out to your eye in this direction through the viewfinder. So you're really seeing exactly what the film is going to see. And so what happens is when you take a picture with this guy and with your film camera or your digital camera, let me set it for you. Yeah, it's not something slow. It goes, and you saw the mirror come up and get out of the way. So what's happening is like the film would be riding back here. And so when I take a picture, that's, it's open. Isn't that just so cool? Yeah, so that's the sound. And that's what I love so much about, like, think about the sound that's on even, cell phones and things. They're mimicking the sound of the mirror coming up on an old SLR film camera. Like, that's the sound that you hear when this thing clicks. It's the mirror going. So it cracks me up. Like, there's not a mirror in your tiny little thing. But they're like, the software designers are like, let's make it sound like there's a mirror. It'll make all those old dogs like Deb accept this better as a camera. And so film, various formats of film. Here's some diagrams of the different sizes of film that are available. And so the cameras that I just passed around, the 35 millimeter, you've probably heard of that, is the type of film that goes inside of this, goes on rolls, and you take a lot of pictures that are kind of postage stamp size-ish. Then the camera that you look down into, the twin lens reflex camera, that takes what we call generically medium format film, which is a wider roll. And so it gets 6x6 centimeters, or it's like 2 1/4 inches by 2 1/4 inches. And so much bigger. The intermediate 2 class is shooting with cameras that take that right now. They're called Holga cameras, and they're plastic toy cameras, but they take really super big film, so they get a little better resolution. The bigger the film, basically, you would think about the better resolution, like how we are with digital cameras. We think of file size of like, oh, that's too small to look good in a PowerPoint, so I can't use it because the pixels will be, too spaced out. It's kind of the same thing with 35 millimeter compared to some of these larger formats. If I take a 35 millimeter negative that's this big and I make a print this big, all the little silver grains that made that up are spread farther out, so it looks grainier. And so that's akin to maybe a, 400 kilobyte file or something, and you're like, I can't use that. But then when you get up to 6x6 or 6x9 format, you can blow that up and you're not going as far, and so you're still keeping a lot of that fineness and resolution. Puff, Alvy Carter is doing his show shooting medium format, I believe, color film, and then scanning the negatives and stuff. So that's partly where he's getting just that beautiful, rich color and detail in those images. And then finally, 4x5 is a camera that I didn't bring in today, but I will bring one in for everyone to look at. And so proportionally, you can see how much bigger it is. And it's basically the size of like a snapshot. I mean, it's 4 by 5 inches. And that, yeah, no rolls. You definitely load that one at a time in film holders. So those are the common film formats. And this is what the cameras look like that take them. So we've seen, this guy, it's kind of smaller because of the slide, but this looks essentially like the single lens reflex camera on steroids, because this is actually a rangefinder camera that takes medium format film. So it's like everything's got to be bigger, you know, but it has the convenience of that you hold it up like this. You're not doing this, and it's got interchangeable lenses. So these two on the right, the rangefinder camera and the Rolleiflex, are examples of medium format cameras that take big film. And then down here, the view camera, that's the guy that you just always use those on a tripod, generally speaking. It's like way too to carry around. But they take the really big negative, and they give you lots of other controls that we can talk about another time. So now, if we move to digital, there's a similar thing. There are different sizes of formats, and most of us working with, you know, what we call entry-level digital cameras. This guy is, you know, if we take the lens off just like we did the other one, you can see it's a smaller mirror, isn't it, than what I was showing you. There are, if you've heard, maybe you've even heard the term full frame digital cameras. This is the reference point for calling them full frame, because this is where they came from, right? So their mirror and sensor is as big as this mirror and the film plane. And then these, which generically get called crop sensor, because again, it's like they're making this sort of thing of saying full frame, like the tan colored rectangle in the image here. Tan is like the gold standard starter place where this all began. And so cropping down from that and making a smaller image with a smaller sensor. And lenses need to be sort of sized a little bit differently too. But so you can see there's a bunch of names and making it really specific, but APS-C is a pretty common size sensor. You can see that occurring twice there. And then there's even, now you're getting really sort of out of the range of the cameras that we would be using in this class, a little smaller than that. There's what was called Micro Four Thirds, which is a nice, really portable littler camera, but still very good quality. And then you get down smaller and smaller. And I think I've got a humorous, yeah, there we go. I like looking at them this way. So right, you just saw the iPhone sensor, didn't you? The first time I looked this up, that was how I reacted, because I'm like, oh, perfect, this will illustrate. And you know, the timing's just about right. That big monster on the right is what I shoot with, and the price has come down a little bit, but it's funny that they put numbers with it to me, because, and now that poor little Canon SX600 is like pretty extinct because we all have cell phones, and why would you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like this slide is maybe from 2014. So a lot has changed in that time. They had phones, obviously, iPhone sensor there, but it's been really remarkable how fast the sort of compact digital cameras have just, you know, like people don't buy them anymore because phone technology has gotten so much better. But anyway, that gives you an idea. Like those little carry them around travel cameras that used to be popular, you know, a couple $100, $300 or something, would have a very small sensor, this little guy. And then entry level, and you know, $450, that's really a starting price. You can wind up paying quite a bit more. I mean, these were like $800 or something. So it's not to say that this crop sensor is a terrible thing. It's just saying, you know, probably the vast majority of the digital cameras that you see in common use, whether it's someone's, you know, nice camera that they spent good money on that they use for their around their house and their artwork and stuff. And then it tends to be more like only if you're really wanting to be a commercial photographer or wanting to really concentrate in photography that you would sink, you know, $3,500 in a camera. Because that's kind of the price without the lens, I think, nowadays. It goes on. But the advantage is, if you think about the size of those sensors, you do get a lot more than just more detail with the larger sensor. It's able to gather more light. I mean, it's just a bigger sheet of sensitive material. So you do see better performance in full frame cameras. What sucks is once you use one, you're never going to want to go back to an APS-C style one. I have an APS-C camera, but I never use it because I can't stand. It's like what? I thought I was going to use it because it was like, oh well, you know, if I go out to the coast where it might get salt water on it or something, then I wouldn't want to bring my good camera. And then I thought, well, so then why am I going to break a camera? Because I'm going to hate the pictures. Because I'm going to know they could have been with the full frame. So then poor Mr. Full Frame is dragged out to the coast of the salt. It is what it is. So more about Aperture now. If you notice, we already sort of talked about Aperture in the form of talking about the lens, right? But what about variable aperture? You know, your pinhole had one choice, and then you like chose whether you should probably spend more time in the shade or whether it was okay to go in the sun if you had it fast enough, you know. So the aperture on your cameras, we've talked about that before, but I thought without all the goofiness, it might be nice to show that screen up here. This is where you control it from. And what you look for is F in front of the numbers, no matter the brand of camera that you're working with. It's going to have a number sequence, sort of like, it's going to have 5.6 in it. That's how I always tell beginners to find, you know, to figure out what sequence they're looking at. Is if it's got decimals, it's definitely going to be the aperture that you're looking at. If it's numbers that go doubling clearly, like, you know, 250, 500, 1000, those are shutter speeds. And they are represented as a fraction. So you can see 1 500 in the little number window over here, right? So we control everything on a digital camera from the back of the camera because it's so electronic. But the shutter is still built in behind the mirror. So if I torture this poor little fella and set it to, there we go. You're looking at the sensor. I'm getting dirt on the school camera sensor, just doing this right now. It's so nice. So that was the actual sensor that you're seeing. You're seeing the mirror come up, and it's basically, it really is. It's a little mimic of what a film camera does, right? Boop. So on a film camera, the aperture would be controlled manually by you by turning a dial up here. And I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to actually do like a film assignment in here where you could check out a camera, go shoot, and then we'll rotate it, hand the camera to the next person, go shoot. I don't have enough for everybody to have a camera at the same time, but I have enough for lots of us to have a camera at the same time. So we'll just sort of rotate it through. So here, that's how you select aperture, and it's just like a number right at the top. And you can see what happens is the larger the number on the f-stop, the larger the opening. In fact, that's another kind of cool little demo that we can do here. Let's see. Oh, nope, I grabbed the wrong kind of camera. The folks down the hall can see that happen, but I'll do it in another video. Don't touch the computer because it'll leave its slide view. That was silly. Oh, good. Now we got to go through that again. There we go. So the higher the number with your aperture, the smaller the opening. That feels a little bit backwards. I know there's a lot of sort of backwards stuff in photography, and this is the start. And so, well, you did the report on Lewis Hine, yeah, Monica? And so this was one of the photos I was thinking of. Lewis Hine, and some of you in reading the artist share things maybe read about Monica's artist, Lewis Hine. He really was instrumental in getting our child labor laws enacted. This is a photo of this young girl who's probably got, you know, a 18-hour shift in this garment factory. And so my understanding was that he was shooting actually with a twin lens type camera, because obviously if he's going into this factory to sort of reveal working conditions that he felt were poor, you know, he's not going to go like, hey, can I come and take pictures of your kids, you know? So he would shoot with the lowest numbered aperture that he possibly could select, so that as much light as he could get into that camera at once he could do. So that's partly just out of logistics, right? Because he's in a dimly lit factory. He can't be setting up a big giant tripod and having everybody pose. And the side effect of using a very wide aperture is that you also then wind up with very little in focus from front, you know, in front of your subject or behind your subject. You get very limited depth of field, in other words. And so here I think it works out really well, because it creates this sort of sense of infinite space behind her as it just sort of blurs off. And then on top of that, it's pretty easy to tell who we're supposed to be, or what we're supposed to be focusing on, what we're supposed to be really having sympathy for in this image. On the right, then, you have an example of the higher aperture number effect. And that's actually been achieved with a 4x5 camera, so the big film. Lots and lots of detail from the very first boulders in the boulder field all the way back to the horizon. If you look at the back of that horizon where the clouds are, even those clouds are in sharp focus. You know, I mean, that is really pretty much infinite focus. And so that's taken by Ansel Adams, who was really interested in capturing the grandeur of our American West. You know, this is at a time somewhat early on when people weren't just traveling everywhere so easily, and they weren't so aware of all the incredible stuff that we really have. And so he and a handful of other photographers were kind of, you know, directly responsible for things like the Sierra Club and various other conservation organizations getting initiated, and even developing the national park system as we know it. And so it was done largely through photography, you know, just making these breathtaking photos and bringing them back to New York and Washington, where the decisions are made, and being like, look at this, you know, we're a young country. We don't have ancient cathedrals that were built hundreds of years ago, you know, but maybe our national treasure is the landscape like this. Yeah, so maybe we should put a little attention to getting the American public out to see what we've got. So there's two really specific motives behind the photographs, and two very specific uses of aperture to support that motive, right? Because with that high aperture, you really feel like you're right there. You know, you really feel like you can see the grass growing in front of that boulder. You can see how sharp it is, and you can see the background. And so it's very experiential. And then with Hine, it's like you can't not look into her face, you know, because and the details of her clothes too are really striking to me. Like, you can tell they're kind of dirty.
Yeah, they're dirty
and they're wrinkled and sweaty. Yeah, they're really sweaty. And there's almost more, to me, emphasis on that than her face. Like, I almost feel like the texture's sharper on the clothing. So another way of thinking of using low depth of field, aka low numbered aperture, is that it's your way as a photographer of pointing, you know, pointing to what's important.
So
yes.
If you have a low depth of field, what would it be, like
just a low number. The scale, there's my mouse. I'm like, point. These f-stops along the top are actually oriented kind of in the continuum that would produce these two. So the lowest end of the scale is going to be your lower numbers, whatever they might be on your particular lens. And then higher numbers are going to produce more of this effect. Now, Ansel Adams was actually shooting with a slightly different camera configuration. And so he actually was shooting with an F number that's not even there. He was shooting with F64. So it would normally go to F32 and then F64 after that with those larger, longer lenses. Louis Hine, on the other hand, I strongly doubt whatever he was shooting with back then had the technology to shoot at 1.4. That's a pretty big aperture, and it's more commonly made popular or possible with computer grinding and technology, you know, of lenses. So probably he was shooting more at like 2.8, if I had to guess. But I think that brings up a good point. It is dependent on the lens, because the lens is where that aperture lives. No matter where you're adjusting from, the aperture is built physically into the lens, not into the camera itself. And so, you know, you could be shooting with the same camera, but switching lenses and wind up with different options available to you in terms of aperture. That used to confound me when I was in beginning photography. Like, no one really emphasized that to me, or I just did the typical student thing. No one ever told me. I was probably snoozing. Good chance of that. So, like this lens on this camera, I would have a choice of f1.4 all the way up to f22. 1.4 is pretty, and you can kind of see, look at the glass on the end of that lens. Now, by comparison, look at the glass on the end of this lens. It's just a little bitty guy, right? And so, I mean, that's not the end-all be-all indicator, but it's going to vary, you know. So if I had a zoom lens maybe for this, or a longer length or something like that, my maximum aperture on that lens might be 4.5. So sometimes you actually do wind up choosing lenses based on where you'll be shooting. Like often on that big camera that I have, even though I have nice zoom lenses that would be super convenient, I will instead select to put on the 50mm prime lens that only does one thing but does it well, because it'll open up wider and it'll give me a little more flexibility if I'm shooting someplace where there's not much light.
So in order to get the light in, then you would have a longer
yes, it's got to be open longer.
Time
Beautiful.
for light to come in, right?
Yeah. So y'all, what she just said was that so depending on your aperture, if the aperture is a smaller opening, you would require more time from your shutter speed to make up for that fact. And that's exactly where we're going with some illustrations. That's awesome that you're already thinking that way. So in fact, lo and behold, the next slide, shutter, more about the shutter. There's where it lives, the shutter speed control. I kind of mentioned earlier that it's going to be the fraction. All the numbers on your shutter speed dial are fractions of a second. And happily now with LCD screens on the back of our cameras, it fully says, you know, 1/500th, 1/250th, you know, 1/60th. And so then if it goes down to the number 1 or the number 2, you know that now you're dealing with whole seconds. So on the ye old film camera, it would actually be a dial that you would turn up here. And you can see the numbers, the way they're printed on there, they just sort of bypass the fraction part, but the radiating numbers are on the outside on the slide shows you what the equivalent is. And the numbers are all really the same from digital camera to film camera. These are full f-stops, if you will. So 1 second, cut it in half, that's half a second, cut it in half, that's a quarter, cut it in half again, you know, and it just keeps going with a little glitch around 15, you know, that shouldn't be quite, but you know, it's close. So what happens essentially is that the light is cut in half when you go up in numbers, and it's doubled when you go down in numbers. And that, it's less apparent, but that's the same thing that's happening with your f-stops.
Yeah.
When you click between two whole stops, those double or half. And that was, we saw that in the Goofy video last time. So here are some visual effects caused by different shutter speeds. So now you're starting to really see the point of shooting in manual and controlling these things and having it be up to you a little bit. On the left, you get this sort of sense of smokiness from this crowd of people that are, I mean, I guess it's a crowd. You kind of don't even know. Yeah, going up the stairs. Maybe it's a subway platform. You don't really know. I sort of assume it's that, but and somehow because of how gray it is, I assume it's in like Eastern Europe. But you can see, what's kind of cool is you can see where their hands have stayed still on the railing for a little longer as their body moved. And so their hands are less hazy, and you can see their feet on the stairs in some place. But then the steady stream of bodies is, you know, that's blurred out. So that would be a really long shutter speed, probably a second or two to have that. Depending, it all depends on how fast your subject is moving as to how blurry it gets.
That's proof that COVID started in Europe.
There it is. I know that I find myself reacting very differently to that slide now. And I mean, this has been in my slideshow for eons, but I look at it, I'm like, oh.
I thought of that. That's terrible.
Yeah, it's gross. Ugh. So these slower shutter speeds, the lower they go, the longer. So this is 1 full second, half a second, quarter second, 8, 15, 30, 60. And on your screen, there'd be a little one drawn over them all. B is short for bulb, and B does really cool things. B just stays open as long as you hold the button down. So, open up. There we go. So this is on B, and you know, it's just, this is what you would use for pictures of the stars and stuff like that, because until you lift it up, it's going to stay open. And you have that also available on your digital camera, of course.
We can't use it.
Oh, you can use it. The only thing you're not really supposed to use on that is your pop-up flash. And that's just because visually you can't possibly really predict where and how the light's going to fall. And actually the pop-up flash is really ugly anyway, because it's just a wall of light. But this, yeah, in the next project after this, you'll be exploring using longer shutter speeds or shorter ones. Right now, for shutter, I would concentrate on just using the numbers 60 and above with your pictures. And the reason being that you're going to get camera shake, creating just blurring in everything if you choose lower ones and you're not stabilizing your camera on a tripod. So that's a really big thing about this assignment that we're going into. I'm like furtively looking around for my little notes, but I had notes to remind you to like how to set up for exploring shooting for this project. Now that you kind of know how to work your camera enough to get started, is set it for a large JPEG file, set it for auto white balance, AWB, so you don't even have to worry about that. But shoot in manual and work on just trying to get the right exposure to understand the meter. And then as far as getting yourself in the ballpark exposure-wise, just, I always sort of start by setting my shutter speed at 125 and then seeing what apertures are available, you know, in the given lighting situation. If y'all shoot outdoors, you're going to have a lot more flexibility. I would set your ISO to 400 and try to just shoot this first, you know, like weekend on 400 alone and to be outdoors to get, you know, really nice, good color and light in your photos. So the faster you go, you're going to be letting less light in, and then that's going to require a wider aperture to make that happen. But you will create more a stop to any moving subjects in your photo. And again, we're going to emphasize this more in the next project. So you don't need to go out there and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to take some blurred motion photos and some stop action photos. Right now, just work on getting some well exposed photos. And sure, you know, if you want to fool with Aperture to sort of understand it more, by all means. But metering is the big thing. And so, yeah, the meter and the pinhole camera, not so much, right? The meter was go out, try it. If it didn't work, try it this way. And the meter became this thing in your head of like, okay, it looks to me like this is the sort of light where my camera needs 14 seconds, you know? So now, the goal with the meter, I told you sort of verbally about this analogy the other day, is to fill it, you want to fill that sensor, give that sensor exactly the amount of light it needs, not more, not less. That's akin to those blocks of light that we saw coming in that video. And so you can see the f-stops are represented there in a little diagram. F16 has a little tiny opening, 11 as a sort of mid-range, F8 wider, and then the elapsed time being diagrammed on the by the red pie plate. So just a very short wedge of time cut out of the clock for 125. Confusingly, it's the cutaway, it's the yellow space that's being represented, not the red space as far as the time. So just, isn't it? I mean, that really vivid red, why, you know, this looks like more time, but no.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Especially because it's the same color as the background.
Yeah, it's like there's nothing there, you know?
It should be the other way.
Yeah, it's a figure ground issue, man.
Yeah. Oh, God.
I mean, we could, I mean, we could argue like, oh, everybody knows a clock goes clockwise, but I don't think that's an excuse. Yeah, so very little amount of elapsed time here, a little more elapsed time here, and a whole bunch of elapsed time here. And but the droplets of water are useful too, you know, see, it's like, see, just a little bit is coming out, but with lots of time, there's enough to fill the bucket. Moderate range coming out, moderate amount of time to fill the bucket. And coming out full force, well, maybe, just a little snippet of time. So that is, I think, a really useful analogy to understand about why you have to follow what your meter says. You can vary what you do to achieve what the meter wants, but you got to pay attention to it. Like if you take a picture and you're aimed at, you know, you're aimed at your subject and your meter is telling you, you know, it's on like +3 or something. If you take that picture, it's just gonna be too light. It just is. You know, you just can't ignore it. You're gonna have to change those settings until the meter is in the middle, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. But here's, you know, like a digital file, if you have too much light, you're gonna lose detail in your highlights. If you have too little light, it's gonna start to look poopy and dark and yucko. This is looking kind of dated too. These are so pixelated and old, but it's like you get sentimental and you don't want to get rid of them. Yeah, they could be JPEGs that have been opened 1,000 times. Poor things. Film. Actually, I think that probably was the technology of the time when I made this slideshow. So in a negative, the reverse happens. Y'all saw this with your pinhole cameras, was like the sky would get really black and you'd think, oh man, that picture didn't come out at all. But then when you took a picture of it and flipped it, you're like, oh, well, who cares if the sky was white? I got all this detail on these leaves. This is really cool. And so you can see that in the middle one with the guy with the dog is like, yeah, the sky is black, but look at the detail in like the foliage around him. You can even see some folds in his jacket and stuff. The dog it's lighter here because that's probably a dark brown spot or something, but you can see just a little bit of highlight where the eye is, and you know, there's some texture there. If you underexpose the negative, you lose detail in the shadows, right? All these things, the dog, this is just sort of white here, and it's really washed out looking. But on the other hand, if you overexpose it, you lose detail in the highlights, and you know, his suit is just, it's just too much light is reflecting off of it and coming in the camera. So here is sort of a diagram of what's inside. I kept explaining like there's a mirror and it flips up and all this, but here's a nice kind of crossways view of it. And it also explains why there's another feature that has sort of hung in there between digital SLR cameras and SLR cameras is that lump on top of the camera, right?
Yeah.
And if you notice, anyone who has a mirrorless camera, they don't have that lump, right? Their camera looks like a pack of cigarettes with a big lens on it. So, so that is this 5-sided prism that's located up here in the middle because it's feeding the eyepiece. And so you can see what's happening in this cross section. You know, if you follow the red line of that light path, it comes in the lens, it bounces up off the mirror, it gets kind of projected onto this translucent screen, rear projection screen style, just like what's going on in the camera you passed around. And then it goes up into this glass prism, which turns it around and sends it out, thank God, right side up to your eye. So you're not trying to compose upside down.
Could you imagine trying to take pictures upside down?
That's what you have to do with a view camera because it just comes straight across and projects it upside down. We always have this joke of like evaluating a photograph, you know, if you can always tell view camera photographers when they're like trying to evaluate your composition because they go, I don't know, yeah, that's pretty good.
That's funny.
Oh, Lord. So then in live view, you can see what happens. Of course, all kinds of magical electronic stuff spits it out to your eye as a nicely reoriented image. And then further here, by the time it hits the LCD screen, what do we know happens to it if you're shooting a JPEG? It's gotten a little tune-up. Like on Zoom, when you can say, touch up my appearance,
Yeah.
it's a little bit of what's happening with the JPEG. The JPEG's like, oh, that's too much highlight. Let's tame that a little bit. Oh, you need a little more light, you know, your shadows, and so it kind of manages things. If you're shooting in a camera that's shooting JPEG.
Phone technology.
Oh no, that's the difference between shooting RAW and JPEG and these guys too. Yeah, the hand computer.
And you can change the setting on your camera, your phone also. Well, I guess it's the
I
file
can't shoot
type,
RAW. Yeah.
not raw.
Yeah. I don't think any of them have devoted that kind of, because the optics would be the optics and the sensor size would be such a limitation that it wouldn't be worth all that extra stuff. But I bet it is somewhat
Right,
close with the
make it
ones that have like 3 lenses, you know, the really nice advanced digital phone cameras. I bet there's something a little bit like that going on with those 3 lenses, that they're really gathering a lot more information from the scene and putting it together in an image, and that's partly why they're so much better. So yeah, like this here, I guess what I'm sort of saying is like what you see through the viewfinder on an SLR type digital camera is really what's coming through the lens at that time. You know, you're seeing the real scene. It's not processed in any way,
Yeah.
but when it comes through and gets electronically generated as an image on the LCD screen, then some things are changing a little bit. You know, it's not quite exactly the same. And so here is the big thing. This is a great slide for showing you what it is you're looking for to give you feedback on whether you've got things set correctly or not.
Is this slideshow on?
It's going to be, I'm recording it, in fact, so you'll get all this as well. But yeah, and if this ends up being hopelessly long, I might even re-record it just a little, you know. So this little mark is the key. This little black rectangle down here needs to be on 0 to indicate that it's like the 3 bears. It's not too little, it's not too much, it's right happily in between. And you move it to the left or right by adjusting either the shutter or the aperture or the ISO, just like in the video. And so that's the little chut-chut that's telling you when it's in the right place or not. And you'll see by changing ISO, you can move it to the left or the right. By changing aperture, you can move it to the left or right. By changing shutter. And eventually you're going to wind up with the right combination. I'm ruling out some of those variables by saying, look, just start with your ISO on 400, because that's a nice, it does well in a range of light. Then as far as shutter speed, let's rule out working with a tripod. Let's say take it from 60th to 1,000, or anything higher than a 60th. And so then with that range in mind and knowing you're shooting outdoors and all that, you're set. You're like, oh, okay. So now I just need to sort of maybe fool with the shutter speed a little bit and the aperture, and I can get it in the middle pretty quickly. So it's not as much like picking a lock as you would think. When you're like, wait, there's 3 different variables and I've got to get it perfect in the middle. Like I could be here all the rest of my life, but no. And then there's another thing I can tell you, which is really a cool trick, is so this +1 and +2, that's meant to be just communicating to you. There's 1 stop too much light, or there's 2 stops too much light. And then here it's saying there's 1 stop too little and 2 stops too little. The way you can think of to fix that also is, if it's on the plus side, set one of these numbers higher. Your f-stop or your shutter speed, when they go higher, they reduce the volume of light. So it kind of actually makes sense. I mean, that's not the reason that this goes from +1 to +2. It's doing it. The reason there's a plus there is just to tell you there's too much light. But coincidentally, if I found the little mark.
Too much light, then you want to reduce the amount of light coming in, which means
Yeah.
you have to adjust one or the other.
Yeah. So if you're adjusting these, you would go higher. So like 4,000, that's probably the highest shutter speed that camera has.
Yeah.
But if this little mark were still on a plus sign, I could go here and I could move this higher. I could go to F8 or I could go to F11 or something like that. And it would start to move it back. So you'll see it move as you're adjusting it. It won't be a big mystery, and it's either there or it's not. You'll see it move.
It will be a
But
mystery.
I mean, it will sort of, but it won't be as much.
Sorry, it will be a
But at
mystery.
least you'll know which way to be going. Like shutter speed, if you don't start somewhere with the shutter speed that's reasonable, there's a lot of shutter speeds. Your digital SLR will go all the way to 30 seconds in full stop increments, and then on up to probably at least 4,000. That's a lot of numbers. There aren't as many aperture numbers, so that's a more finite list. So if we start at least by getting our shutter speed set to say 125, and figure, all right, I'm not going any lower than 60 on under any conditions, but I can go higher. That really thins down the numbers and makes it much easier for you to wind up in the right place with your exposure. So we don't need to talk too much about camera meters in film cameras, but this is just an example of one. It would tell you in the viewfinder. And if you're not sure about reading your meter, if you're reading it correctly, this is just kind of a cool rule to know. It's called the Sunny 16 rule too. It's such a happy name. So the Sunny 16 rule, like if I were out shooting with this little fellow and his meter was totally dead, or better yet, how about a real dinosaur? Sorry, I called you a dinosaur. It's like, I'm your elder, don't talk to me like that. So I'm outside with this little guy and I'm shooting a roll of 400 speed film and it's sunny out. What I do is I set my aperture to f16 because it's the Sunny 16 rule, right? So I've got the sun, I've got the f16. Now my ISO, I have 400 ISO. I just picked a shutter speed that's closest to that. So 500, that's pretty close. Now I'm gonna get pictures that are pretty good and I didn't even use a meter. Now, if it's shady out, or you're inside your grandmother's living room and there's only one lamp lit, the Sunny 16 rule doesn't do you a whit of good. But if you're outdoors, it's a good way to fake it. I feel like my batteries died at my uncle's wedding and I used the Sunny 16 rule on some of the film I shot. So it's pretty cool. And then actually they've extended these things out from here. Like a sunny day with strong shadows, maybe a few clouds, f16 at whatever your ISO is. And then if it's just super bright, like you're on the beach, you're in Fort Myers or something, and there's a lot of glare, then yeah, go down to 22. And you can see you're just opening up, widening that aperture opening a little bit as the conditions get dimmer. So it's kind of cool little thing. Here's a more specific thing of the optical paths. And I think really the only thing that's cool and useful to show about this is just how complex these damn things are. Oh my God. See all that glass and all those parts that have to turn inside that lens? Like, that's why you don't drop that thing, that's for sure. And I'm not saying that's exactly how this little lens looked. That's a zoom lens, but still, you know, those are called elements, all those little separate pieces of glass, whether they're convex or concave. And then outside in cross section, you can see these gears, helicoid gears and things like that, that makes them stretch in and out precisely right to change your angle of view and focus and, you know, all the rest. Blows my mind.
Technical.
Yeah.
Your brain's figured that out.
Oh.
Different than my brain.
Yeah, yeah. I know one answer, not my brain.
I know it looks good, but I can't figure that out.
Yeah. Boy, and you know what else is cool is just looking at, I mean, we make jokes about, you know, Swiss craftsmanship and German engineering, and you totally see it in things like Leica is a brand of camera that is so beautifully crafted, like just when you click the little things, yeah, like you can feel that the tolerances are like they'd make a Rolex cry. I mean, it's amazing. So, and I forget, you guys will, if you check these out, maybe run across this, like when you're focusing, there's a little focusing screen, that translucent surface where the image is projected up onto. There's like this cool little circular sort of prism looking section in the middle of it.
Is it magnified?
And this, it looks like it's magnifying it. It's not, it's regular scale. But what happens is, like, if you line up a linear subject to cross that split, when it's out of focus, that subject will be not aligned. And as you pull it into focus, it'll line up. You know, so like you could put it aimed at the side of a building. And it's great because, yeah, if it's sort of dim and it's a little hard to see, or your subject is sort of smooth, like if I was trying to focus on that whiteboard there, that'd be pretty hard. But if I align with the edge of where it's bumped out there, it'd be dead easy to lock that in with that type of focusing screen. I think that's something that would still be useful if we used manual focus on these guys more than we do. But we really don't use it that often. Autofocus actually uses the same technology. It looks for lines, you know, and uses them to focus on. But it's just, it's so good, you hardly even need to worry about having a really good focusing screen view. So there's another thing of the lens and how they
The
kind
way
of do
I
their thing.
set something, mine has these points.
Yeah, we talked about those last class. And I would recommend that you set it in the middle,
Okay.
because that way you know exactly what you're focusing on, and the camera is not going to hijack your point of focus and say, oh, well, you know, on the average, these 3 leaves from this tree around the edge, or there are more of them in a plane. I don't know. It's like it does a pretty good job, but the time that it doesn't is going to be the time that makes you mad. So I like leaving it on that right in the middle, and then I can do the focus lock thing we talked about and take my picture and just go from there. And this is like the last frame, but I know I talk a lot about angles of view, and I throw out the word telephoto, zoom lens, or wide angle lens. And this is just sort of showing you, without getting too numbered, I mean, you don't have to worry about these numbers at all, but you can see, like, it's just showing you like what the camera sees and how, you know, sort of the normal range is right about here, like what you would kind of perceive with your eye as you stand in the room is kind of that-ish. And so then if you get a shorter lens, like with a lower number to it, 24, 15, something like that, then you're going to get more things from the side in your shot. Like this is an extreme wide angle view. And y'all probably, these shoot with a really wide angle of view, partially because it works so well for a selfie, right? Because it includes a lot. If it were too zoomed in, your arm wouldn't be long enough. So we are very used to getting wide angles of view, and then, you know, you sort of zoom in and you, if you want to. But so that top picture really kind of looks like maybe a cell phone type of a photo, right? That you can get that super wide view. The one of the bird does not look like a cell phone photo at all, does it? When you're shooting with what we call a telephoto lens, a longer lens, you're taking a much smaller angle of view, but then of course as it's coming into the camera, it's getting kind of spread out onto the film or the sensor. And so the result is, you can see it looks sort of flattened, doesn't it? Like the bird's butt is facing us, but it almost looks like the bird is just a little round thing, right? And that's a common effect of telephotos, is they have sort of a flattening effect. We've all seen how portraits look too, depending on, you know, a super wide angle of view. Sometimes, like if you get really close to the lens, your nose looks really big, and it's not as flattering.
True.
So portrait photographers tend to like on one of these cameras, portrait photographers would probably prefer to shoot with something like a 40 or a 50 millimeter lens as opposed to an 18, you know, because it's sort of a happy medium. It's not too zoomed in and flattening, but it's, you know, kind of taming our features a little bit, flattering in our Western culture. So, yeah, I could stop share now that you're not. Emma Lefebvre, why is Emma Lefebvre the speaker? I'm gonna stop recording.